Well, as I said a while ago, Rick's not with us today, so you've got a member of the scout team to come in to be with you. So if you'll elevate your patience and lower your expectations, we'll get through this all right. We're studying chapter 23 of Genesis today, and this talks about the death of Sarah, Abraham's wife, and his negotiating with the Hittites for a place to bury her. I want to say a word or two about the Hittites. At this time, the Hittite group had control of the area of Canaan that Abraham was in. You know, for years, people, mainly the paleontologists and archaeologists, said there was no such thing as the Hittites. We couldn't find any record of them. And yet the Bible talks about the Hittites. Well, in the late 1800s, they found a number of clay tablets in this area that spoke of the Hittites. And then later, in 1907, they found a large group of tablets that talked about a vast Hittite nation which covered most of Syria and went into what is today Turkey. So the Hittites have been well established, and those are the people that the early Hittites are the ones that Abraham is going to be negotiating with today. Some of the history says that this group was descended from Noah through Ham, and then through Canaan, his grandson, and then through Heth, his great-grandson. So we're going to look at the death of Sarah and Abraham negotiating for a place to bury her. Very little generally is said in the Bible about a person's death. Normally it'll say he lived so many years and he died. Some of the kings in 2 Kings and particularly in 2 Chronicles deal with kings this way. And yet we have an entire chapter here that deals with the death and burial of Sarah. So there is something significant going on here. Why do you think he goes into so much detail about the death of this wife? It goes back to Abraham and the promise of God. And we'll take a look at that. Let's see if I can get this thing to work. Well, it did work too well. Here we go. It's been about 15 years since I made a PowerPoint presentation, so you bear with me. Sarah lived to be 127 years old. She died at Kiriath Arba, which is Hebron, in the land of Canaan, and Abraham went to mourn for Sarah and to weep for her. 127 years old. You remember that she was 10 years younger than was Abraham. So Abraham had known her all of her life, and she had known him all of his life after he was 10 years old. You know, she's the only woman in the Bible whose age is given at the time of death. She was Abraham's half-sister by his father, by another wife. When she died, her body was placed in a tent, and Abraham went there to mourn for her. Now, we assume that Abraham is in Hebron. You remember when he came off the mountain with Isaac, he went to Beersheba, and then some things and some time intervened in between that and this account. So we assume that he was in Hebron, and he went to mourn and weep for her. This is the only time that Scripture mentions Abraham weeping. And he had had a number of disappointing things happen in his life, and disappointments and heartbreak. You remember, first of all, he had his nephew Lot, which was his brother's son, to come with him out of Haran. And then they had a dispute, and Lot left him. And I'm sure that was a disappointment for Abraham. He went, as you remember, into the area of Sodom. Later on, when Abraham took matters into his own hands, he and Sarah, and he had a son by Hagar. Abraham loved this son. And when there was a conflict between the two boys at a very early age, when Isaac was just a baby, Sarah demanded that he get rid of Hagar and her son. And I'm sure this pulled at Abraham because he had great affection for that boy. And you'll notice later on, when Abraham dies 175 years old, Ishmael and Isaac both come back to bury him. So there was a strong attachment there. I'm sure he had fond memories of Sarah that tugged at his heartstrings and caused him to weep at this time. He must have remembered how loyal she was to leave everything she had and follow him into this strange country at the promise of some God that had made to him. He surely remembered the joys of when Isaac was born. You know, they'd been looking for him for, my word, all of their life, and now they're 90 years old and this child is born. Abraham must have had some thoughts too that pretty much crushed him when he remembered that because of his fear of Pharaoh and Abimelech and his selfish desire to preserve himself at all costs, he had exposed Sarah to some danger there. And it was only because of the intervention of God that she was prohibited from having harm come to her. Between the story of the sacrifice of Isaac and this event, some time had occurred in between that, and Abraham had gotten some messages from his home country about his brother Nahor and about the children that had been born to him. And I'm sure there was an emotional attachment back to where he had lived earlier. And so there is a natural tendency to want to take your wife and go back home and bury her there. We've all, I'm sure, I know I have experienced this. But instead, Abraham insists on burying her in Canaan. And why was this? Well, it's obvious to us that Abraham was dependent on the promises of God, that this would become the inheritance of his descendants. This would become their country. And so he wanted to bury his wife in this country. You know, at this time, Abraham, and I think this is significant because this wasn't just a little journey where he was wandering around in Canaan for a little while. He had been there 42 years, and he had received precious little, in fact, no land at all. So he was counting on that promise that God made to him, that his descendants would own this land, the land of Canaan, and yet he had received absolutely nothing but the promise. Let's see if we can look at another series of verses here. In verses 9 through 11, by faith Abraham made his home in the promised land like a stranger and a foreigner in the country. He lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob after him, who were heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God. All these people were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance, admitting that they were foreigners and strangers on earth. People who say such things show that they're looking for a country of their own. If they had been thinking of the country they had left, they would have had an opportunity. Bear with me. To return. Instead, they were longing for a better country, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, and he has prepared a city for them. Of course, this is from the great chapter 11 in Hebrews, where the great men of faith are recounted for the recipient of the letter of Hebrews. And all of these people, this was characteristic of them. The point of all of this, the point of this 23rd chapter, I think, is that at Sarah's death, Abraham was brought to a decision point. Where will I bury Sarah? Actually, it went deeper than that. It was, where shall I be buried myself? Because generally when you procured a burial plot, at this time it was for the whole family. And as I said earlier, after 42 years, he had not received any part of this land. Let's try this one more time. All of these people in Hebrews were commended for their faith, yet none of them received what they had been promised, since God was planning something better for them, so that only together with us they would be made perfect. Abraham refers to himself here in verses 3 and 4 as a skeptic, as a foreigner and a stranger, as an alien in the land. And you can just see, if there were skeptics standing around at this time, knowing his background, they would probably say, this man left his own country. He had a promise from this God, and here he is, and he doesn't even have a place to bury his wife. The next few verses that we're going to look at have to do with the negotiations between Abraham and the Hittites. You know, this may seem strange to us, what went on here. We can only understand this transaction in the light of the culture. We normally today don't do negotiation this way, but in many parts of the country, in the Middle East and sometimes south of us, they still continue to do this process in this way. Legal transactions were typically conducted at the city gates. You remember from Job, that was one of the places where Job spent time as an elder in the city, at the city gates, where there were the people who could be witnesses to business transactions and intervene in the negotiation of those transactions. And I forgot his name. I was going to give another example, but it slipped my mind right now. Items of agreement were determined by a sequence of back and forth negotiations. Let's see if I can. Then Abraham arose from beside his dead wife, and he spoke to the Hittites, saying, I am a foreigner and a stranger among you. Sell me some property for the burial site here so I can bury my dead. The Hittites replied to Abraham, Sir, listen to us. You're a mighty prince among us. Bury your dead at the choicest of our tombs. None of us will refuse you his tomb for burying his dead. At that, Abraham rose and bowed down before the people of the land of the Hittites and said to them, If you're willing, let me bury my dead and listen to me and intercede with Ephron of Zophar on behalf, so he will sell me the cave at Machpelah, which belongs to him at the end of his field. Ask him to sell it to me for the full price as a burying site among you. This is probably one of the most well-documented and well-known sites in Israel. This is a mosque that has been built over that site, and this is the cave, supposedly, that Abraham was negotiating for. Abraham wanted the cave, first of all. That's what he asked for. The response came back a little differently from that. Ephron the Hittite was sitting among his people, and he replied to Abraham in the hearing of all the Hittites who had come to the gate of the city. No, my lord, he says, listen to me. I give you the field, and I give you the cave that is in it. I give it to you in the presence of my people to bury your dead. Abraham wanted a cave. The response back was, I will give you the cave and the field. Now, this was I'm sure, a sincere offer of this Hittite, but it is not one that Abraham could have accepted and still maintained his honor. It made it all. Ephron wanted him to buy both of these, and we'll see a little later on that there's something attached to buying the cave and the field rather than just buying the cave. So, again, Abraham bowed down before the people of the land. He said to Ephron in their hearing, listen to me. If you will, listen at this. I will pay the price of the field. Accept it from me so that I can bury my dead. He's made a commitment here. He's made a commitment to buy not only the cave, but the field. He's allowing this man Ephron to be pretty noble in offering the field and throwing in the cave as a bonus for it. The sale is now underway. What is left is to establish the price. Notice what happens next. Ephron answered Abraham, listen to me, my lord, the land is worth 400 shekels of silver, but what is that between you and me? Bury your dead. Abraham has allowed him to set the price. He has showed his extreme generosity by offering to give him the field. That puts Abraham in a certain position that he can't honorably back out from. Abraham agreed to the terms and weighed out the price that he had named in the hearing of the Hittites. 400 shekels of silver according to the weight current among the merchants. Ephron is sounding very generous, but we will see a little later on he's pretty greedy about all of this. It makes it impossible for Abraham to go back and say, whoa, that's a pretty big price for this field. Let's negotiate some more, because he has already offered to give it to him free for nothing. It's kind of like some of the salesmen we encounter in life today. Abraham pays the price, but later we'll find out he has been taken. There's another case when a field was bought. In Jeremiah chapter 32, God tells Jeremiah, go to one of your relatives and buy a field. Now, God had said that he was going to destroy many of the people of Judah, and the remnant he was going to exile into Babylon. But he tells Jeremiah at this point, as a demonstration to the people, as an object lesson to the people, to go to your relative and buy a field. The significance of this was the expectation and the demonstration that God intended to bring the people back. So Jeremiah was buying this field, expecting to come back and reclaim this field. Unfortunately, he never did. The significant thing is the price of the field that Jeremiah paid, 17 shekels. Here, hundreds of years earlier, Abraham's buying a plot of ground, a field, for 400 shekels. So Abraham did not get a good bargain out of all of this. You'll notice that he said, so Ephraim's field in Machpelah near Mamre, both the field, the cave, and all the trees within the borders of the field was deeded to Abraham as his property in the presence of all the Hittites who had come to the gate of the city. Afterward, Abraham buried his wife in the cave in the field of Machpelah near Mamre in the land of Canaan. There's something else interesting about this transaction. If Abraham had only bought the cave, he would not have, in the eyes and in the laws and rules of the Hittites, owned property. But when he bought this field, no longer was he a stranger, but he came under the king of the Hittites at that time, and he assumed all of the obligations toward the Hittites for this field, any taxes, anything that was required because he owned this field. So Ephron, in selling the field, number one, he got a real good price for it, got an excellent price for it. Number two, he transferred all the responsibility to Abraham for that field, where if he had just bought the cave, it would have been a different situation altogether. Why do you think this story is here? This is the death of Abraham's wife. This is the negotiation for a place to bury his wife, but there are great many details here. All of this is, I believe, is in this chapter because the purchase of the cave to bury his wife was an expression, an outward expression of Abraham's faith in God and what God had promised him, and the fact that he believed that God was going to fulfill that promise. Let's look again, or look at Hebrews 11 again. Talking about the people in chapter 11 that are given as examples of faith, all of these people were still living by faith when they died. And you remember these people. They did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance, admitting that they were foreigners and strangers on earth. People who say such things show that they're looking for a country of their own. If they had been thinking of the country they had left, they had opportunity to return. Instead, they were longing for a better country, a heavenly one. Therefore, God was not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. And thus the writer of Hebrews said that these people, and Abraham is one of their examples, were looking for a better country. There were foreigners and strangers on this earth. This cave is where Abraham will be buried. It's where later on his descendants will be buried. And you'll remember that Isaac was, he himself was buried there. Isaac was buried there. Rachel was buried there. Leah was buried there. And when Jacob and his sons and their families went into Egypt, stayed there quite a while, when he died, he was brought back to the cave at Machpelah, and he was buried there. Dear friends, I urge you as foreigners, exiles, to abstain from sinful desires which wage war against your soul. Live such good lives among people that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us. Submit yourselves to the Lord's sake for every human authority, whether to the governor or the emperor's supreme authority, or to governors who are sent to punish him, who punish those who do wrong, and to commend those who do right. For it is God's will that by doing good you should silence the ignorant talk of foolish people. Live as free people, but do not use your freedom as a cover-up for evil. Live as God's slaves, show proper respect to everyone, love the family of believers, fear God, and honor the emperor. What's the point of this? Well, as Abraham became a citizen by buying this property, he was subject to the laws of the Hittites. He had dual citizenship. He had citizenship in the Ur of the Chaldees, where it had originated, and also now in Hebron. We too have dual citizenship. We too, in some sense, are strangers and sojourners here on earth, looking for our reward, which we have not achieved yet, but will in eternity. Abraham was subject to the rules and the regulations of the Hittites. And so Peter is telling us, while you have dual citizenship, while you live here on earth, you also are to be subject to the authorities that are over you and to obey them. Pay taxes, respect the government, obey the laws, honor the officials. It's interesting too that later on you're going to, if you stay on this study, you're going to see that when Joshua led the children of Israel to the edge of the land of Canaan, and they began to divide the land up. You remember Caleb? He was one of the two spies, he and Joshua, that came back from those who spied out the land and said, we can take this land. The others said, no, we can't, because there are giants in the land. And because they refused to trust God, they wandered 40 years in the wilderness, and all over 20 years of age died in that wilderness, except two people, Joshua, who now had led the children of Israel to the land, and Caleb. When Joshua divides the land up, he gives the hill country, including Hebron, to Caleb. And you can imagine how excited he was to go in with the army, take this land, knowing that at one time it had belonged to his father Abraham. Notice in Ecclesiastes the writer says, God has made everything beautiful in its time. He has also set eternity in the heart. That is an amazing statement to me, that there is something that God has placed in us, something inherent with us as human beings that has an idea of eternity in our makeup, in eternity in our heart. We need to be reminded that death may be the worst thing that will happen to us here on this earth, but the promise still remains, and the best is yet to come. And sometimes that escapes us. It's a little difficult for us to keep before us that the best is yet to come. We have promises from God that will go beyond our death. And we have all lost loved ones. I have lost a brother and a sister, my mother and father. And I can remember my son telling my brother when we knew he was going to die, you have friends on both sides. You have promises ahead of you that God will keep. And what a comfort that should be to us. This pretty well closes out what I have to say about the 23rd chapter. I would like to make a few remarks, though. I think it is very good that we're looking at the life of Abraham here. I think it is good for all of us. I know it is good for me to go back and look at these Old Testament writings, Genesis, Exodus, the giving of the law, but particularly to look at the prophets. And why is it important for us today to look at the prophets? What are the prophets? God is talking to his representatives about his people. God is telling these prophets, this is what I expect from my people. This is where they have done wrong. This is where they have offended me. And this is what I'm going to do to punish them, but I still love them. In the case of Judah, I'm going to bring them back. To me, one of the most significant things about us looking at these things is that we, from the Old Testament scriptures, particularly in God's dealing with the prophets, get a truer, clearer idea of our God. If you look at the TV today and some of the people who are expounding on God, you see all kind of weird ideas about who God is, what God is going to do, what all of these things. They're strange. Even in our own fellowship, you encounter different ideas about God that are inconsistent with how God reveals himself in the Old Testament. And in the Old Testament is where we see Jehovah, Yahweh, dealing with his people, revealing himself. Jesus Christ is the center and the object of the New Testament. And God began looking for that period of time, actually when he exiled Judah into Babylon. At that point on, the focus was, I'm going to bring them back. I'm going to set over them my servant David. Well, David had been dead for hundreds of years. Who was that servant David? It was Jesus Christ. That's who he was referring to. That's when he called them back together. So Jesus is the focus of the New Testament. He is the example for us. He helps us understand how God looks at us, how God relates to us. But to get that deeper view of God and how he really thinks about his creation, I think the Old Testament scriptures, looking at Abraham, how he was patient with Abraham as his faith grew. There are a number of times when Abraham didn't exhibit the faith that we may have expected him to exhibit, but God was patient with him, and God was working with him to build that faith. And in the final analysis, as we have seen today, when it came to determine a place to bury his wife and for himself to be buried, that promise of God was premier in his mind, that he has promised this land to my descendants, and I am fully convinced that he will preserve me and that he will preserve them, and that promise will be fulfilled. I thank you for being patient with me today. I thank you for being here. It's been a pleasure to be with you. Thank you.